Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're gonna start with Tupac, and dear God, like, where do you even start with like a Tupac bio? I was telling Josh, I'm like, we're trying to dial back our bios a little bit to save time, and I was laughing because last week was going to be my first time with those instructions, and I'm
Yeah.
like, so I get Tupac, the guy who literally still gets like five episode miniseries about like just one part of his life, like his death or his childhood along the way, but. Here's my attempt to do a condensed version of Tupac, who we somehow shockingly have not done an album by at this point. We've done songs of his, but not albums. Tupac also has one of my like top 10 album names ever, Tupacalypse Now, which I think is one of the great album names ever. All Eyes with a Z on Me is what we're covering this week. All right, so Tupac Amaru Shakur is not Tupac's given name. It was a name given to him by his mom, who was a Black Panther, and with whom both of his parents actually, he was born in New York City. So even though he became synonymous with the West Coast, Tupac went from New York City to Baltimore, and so he spent most of his life as an East Coast guy. So go figure there. But he was born Lesane, Lesane, Parish Crooks, June 17, 1971. While his changed name was Tupac, Tupac, it was stylized as the Tupac that we know of, the number 2, and then PAC for his stage name. And he also had an alter ego of Machiavelli, and we're going to be covering that album, the Don Columinati Theory, which hilariously has like made a comeback as like a thing that people actually believe now, as opposed to like like that's where like the Illuminati and shit, you know, when you go to YouTube down that goes back all the way to here. So yeah, anyway, he is one of the best-selling music artists of all time, having sold 75 million records worldwide, which is pretty crazy. Many of them are posthumous too, because Tupac died at the age of 25, Josh, which for some reason I thought he made it to 27 like Biggie did, but he did not. He was actually even younger than I remember.
It's so young in retrospect. The older I get.
It seemed young even when it happened when I was there. I think I was 16 when Tupac died, and it still seemed like he was a young man. Like, I didn't think he was like an age peer, but he also was like young enough that I was like, oh, he's like young. You know what I mean? So this is actually Tupac's fourth album, solo album. He had Tupacalypse Now, which I talked about before. Strictly, well, I can't say that, but Strictly for My, and then Word that we have to redact right there as the second one, and then Me Against the World was his third album.
I had that one, Me Against the World.
Yeah, I had a couple of these different albums. He also was releasing lots of tracks for soundtracks, some for movies he was on, like Juice, Poetic Justice, Above the Rim, and Gang Related, among others. He's a pretty prolific actor. I don't think I realized he had as many credits as he did as a film actor. If you go online, you can actually see Tupac's like high school performing arts. He went to a performing arts high school in Baltimore, right? Famously, with Jada Pinkett was also there. And it's funny, you could see like, I think what's like his senior project, and he's talking about like how the school transformed him, and he talks about like how he was exposed to like ballet, and as it's happening, Wuthering Heights by Kate Bush is in the background, and he's talking about like his appreciation for her. So it's Kate Bush is quickly entering that line of like Kiss, right, where somehow like everybody likes Kate Bush, like even like regardless of what it is. So just like everybody, regardless of what their music ended up sounding like, listened to Kiss as a teenager. So like yeah, I think that's it. But so Tupac, as I said before, born in East Harlem, New York. His parents were Black Panthers, and his dad spent a fair amount of time incarcerated. He was actually named after Tupac Amaru II, who was an indigenous leader and a descendant of the last Incan ruler, who was executed after his revolt against Spanish rule. I listened to a podcast, Josh, called The Fall of Civilizations, which I can't recommend enough. It's incredible.
Well, that sounds
and
right
I
up my
actually
alley.
just listened to it's so good. Like, if you're listening to this, check out Fall of Civilizations. I have no problem giving that a listen. It's dense, but it's fantastic. Anyway, I had just listened to one about the Incas, which on a very sad podcast in general, like many of these cases, like the fall of them, it's super sad. That and Easter Island are tied for the saddest falls of civilizations. So he has an older stepbrother as well as a half sister as well, who's 2 years younger than him. But yeah, the consciousness of an educated mother who valued, basically the educational process and more so even outside of just traditional school, like becoming well-read and knowing about culture and knowing history, and especially like Black history, that was part of like the Black Panther, movement as well. Famously, Tupac's godmother, Asada Shakur, was involved in a pretty... I'm from New Jersey. She was involved in a pretty famous shooting of a New Jersey state trooper in 1977. And she escaped from prison in 1979 and has actually been on the run ever since.
Oh, wow.
So it's a pretty famous case in New Jersey. Was convicted of first-degree murder in 1977, but then escaped from prison and has actually been on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list since 2013, his godmother. So Tupac had some interesting people around him. So while his mom was looking for work and struggling with drug addiction, they actually moved to Baltimore, Maryland, when Tupac was in his early teens. And he lived in the Penn Lucy neighborhood, for those that know Baltimore. And as I said, he went to the Performing Arts High School. He did his 9th grade year at Dunbar High School, public high school in Baltimore, and then transferred to the Baltimore School for the Arts. He studied acting, poetry, jazz, and ballet, and was considered particularly adept at Shakespeare, who he was a big fan of. He released a list of favorite albums when he was in there, and there was a fair amount of rap on there, and he did win a beatboxing and a rapping contest, but he also included in his top 10 list albums by U2, Kate Bush, Sinead O'Connor, and Culture Club as his favorite acts. He was friends with Jada Pinkett, and she sort of mentions they might have had like a romantic connection. It never kind of came up during his life, so I'm not sure. But he did date Mary Baldrich, who was the daughter of the local chapter of the Communist USA Party as well. So, yep. So he did not graduate, though, unfortunately, because his family moved to California toward the end of his time there, the San Francisco area. He got his GED, but it wasn't that he didn't get it because he wasn't doing school well or like truant, right? It just was the move, and then kind of life got in the way. He moves to that San Francisco area in 88 and begins rapping. He actually, interestingly enough, considering where his life goes, his stage name is MC New York, which is wild when you think about he was like a prominent figure on the West Coast side of things. It just goes to show how that was fluid. And he actually, after about 2 years, and we covered this when we did Sex Packets by the Digital Underground, but he becomes a member of Digital Underground in the early 90s. Increasingly is featured more on their albums. I think his big break is he it raps on a Digital Underground song called Same Song, and that's on the Nothing But Trouble soundtrack, and people really liked it, and so he ends up connecting with Randy Stretch Walker, who takes him into being a solo artist. And 2PAC-ALL Now, as I said before, is there. 2PAC-ALL Now is immediately controversial, which is kind of crazy because it's way less gangster rap, right, than his other ones. There's a lot of songs like Brenda's Got a Baby and Trap that he's like very... Tupac always has a little bit of political consciousness, but like it's really on that album, right? But famously, Dan Quayle, the vice president at the time, like hated this album, and he said, quote, "There's no reason for a record like this to be released. It has no place in our society." And so Tupac kind of said,
hyperbolic.
I just wanted to rap about things that affected young black males. When I said that, I didn't know that I was going to tie myself down to just take all the blunts and hits for all young black males to be the media's kicking post for young black males. So this is sort of like the first time. If you go back and listen to that album, it's kind of wild that like that was the album they just, especially when you like listen to this album we're covering today, like
Right.
All Eyes on Me, which leans in a very different direction. 2 years later, he releases Strictly 4, Along That Way, where he's kind of bringing in some like more hardcore street elements, I would say, is where it comes in. He gets the tattoo Thug Life at that point along the way, and joins a collective called Thug Life with various other rappers in the area. And then it's hard to not mention that, he's friends with Notorious B.I.G. and the Junior Mafia at this point, and supposedly, I don't know how true this is, Notorious B.I.G. actually asked Tupac Shakur to manage him. And Tupac directed him to Puffy instead, and said he would make him a star, is how the story goes. It's actually been repeated by a couple different people. I'm sure there's some hyperbole to it, but it seems like most people said he was serious about thinking that Tupac would be a good manager. They were very good friends. However, there was a shooting at Quad Studios in New York in 1994. And that is where they have a falling out, because Tupac believed that Biggie, or Bad Boy in general, records were part of that shooting, that he feels that sort of it was set up by them. Now, whether or not that was actually a thing that happened, we don't know. Like, different people will give you different takes on that, but yeah, so there you go. Also around this time, Tupac was accused of and convicted of sexual assault, and spent time in prison in 1995, where famously he became a pen pal and kind of sort of dated Madonna during this time, which came out like 20 years later. Oh yeah, you didn't know that? Yeah, so 20 years later that kind of came out, and there were some notes that were written. So during this time, Tupac's getting, I would say, a little bit more radicalized in like the fast life, I would say. I think he kind of had abandoned some of the stuff earlier because there was like an anger at societal injustice, but also like his own stuff that he was working through, I think. I don't want to go deep into the psychology of it, but during the time that he is imprisoned, he contacts Suge Knight, and Suge Knight travels to visit him and signs him, and then famously goes to the Source Awards and rips on Puffy, which in retrospect is an interesting, Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man type scenario, I think, at that point. And yes, joins Death Row in late 1995, and releases his only solo album on Death Row, All Eyes on Me, on February 13th, 1996. It was Rap's first ever double album. Josh, and boy was it in terms of length of this album, because it was over 2 hours long. It also met the criteria for 2 of the 3 albums for Tupac's contract with Death Row, which would have been interesting, and definitely was themed around the idea of the gangsta lifestyle, and really having almost no political messages at all, unlike his other albums. And a lot of people mentioned that it was like Tupac was a different person coming out of jail. He also releases Hit 'Em Up, one of the most famous diss tracks ever, as a B-side off of this. It's crazy to think like, well, I've got like 40 songs on this album, but I just couldn't fit that one on there, right? So, and everybody is on that. It won Rap Album of the Year at the 1997 Soul Train Music Awards and the 1997 American Music Awards. But unfortunately, at that point, Tupac had attended a Mike Tyson fight in late 1996, and unfortunately was the victim of a drive-by shooting, which I believe is now solved, if I remember correctly, after years of it not being solved. Yeah, they convict. Well, he was dead, wasn't he?
Or he died? Yeah,
I think he was dead, but they figured out who it was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That sounds right.
And at the time of his death, he actually had just about finished the Don Columinati, the 7-Day Theory, under the stage name of Machiavelli, which ended up becoming his 5th and final album that he knew was going to be released. Of course, 17,000 other albums were released as Tupac. Some approved, some not approved, of the voluminous amounts of like somewhat completed, slightly completed, almost completed tracks that he was always working on. Tupac was known for being highly prolific in terms of the amount of material he was working on at any time. So I'm gonna stop there
Yep.
because there's so much more, but pretty much that's
No, I
a
think
little
that was
bit
a
of
good that was a good
Yep.
summary. Hmm.
a little bit of a summary of Tupac. So one of the longest albums we've ever covered. I think
Yeah.
it might be the longest album we ever covered right here. It was longer than Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, which I thought would have been the longest we ever covered, which is wild. What'd you think of this one?
So I had not listened to this album in a long time. Certainly, I enjoyed the album. I kind of went on a roller coaster of I was in a roller coaster of emotions on this album. Um, there's no
What is it? A glass
glass
house of
case,
emotions?
yeah.
Glass case emotions.
um, there's no question that he's talented, and that there are like an incredible, like the first album is probably the first album for me is way better than the second disc. The first, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 songs are like incredible, like an incredible hit after hit on this album. And I really like his delivery. He makes rapping seem so easy, and he's so emotive and playful, while also being like profane and aggressive, and really kind of having that dichotomy of like thug life, but also like having like a tender side or like a more thoughtful side. That comes throughout this album. I really like, there's so many, I think the production is really solid on this album as well. He's front and center, but the beats are great. I think the guest appearances by artists is varied, and there's some great appearances on here. I mean, first and foremost being Nate Dogg making an appearance, one of my favorites in terms of like what's the baseball term for, he's like the guy who's like a clutch
Utility
like
man?
player. Yeah, utility man who comes in and like makes, like, really helps out. He like always makes every track better, in my opinion.
He is the ultimate utility.
Yeah.
Glue guy is another
Yeah.
term you could say.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Or sixth man, maybe, if we're talking about basketball, right?
Yep.
And so he's great. Snoop Dogg makes an appearance. That's great. I love Casey and JoJo on How Do You Want It. That's an all-time track as well. Got My Mind Made Up.
Like, dude, if you're going to make a sex jam, like, you kind of have to have, like, Casey and JoJo if you want to make the ultimate sex jam. Yeah.
And then I really like Method Man on Got My Mind Made Up, and Redman. I like how he kind of like there was no like rivalry with the Wu-Tang. He was friends with everyone, I feel like.
I love how the Wu-Tang Clan are just, like, I was talking about this with my buddy Jeff, who's guested on the show. I'm like, I think it's amazing that, like, the Wu-Tang Clan were, like, Switzerland.
Yeah,
they
were
whole
like,
Wu-Tang
exactly.
Clan. They just floated through just with no beef,
Yep. I love it. I love how they were above it all. And so that's great. And so, I mean, you could listen to the first 5 or 6 songs and that should be enough. Some criticisms of this album: it's too long. There's no reason for this to be a double album. I feel like it really tested. I mean, I split it up too multiple times. I mean, I listened to this, we had multiple weeks at this point. I listened to this album multiple times, and there's just too much filler or not strong enough songs that worked for me on this. There are some good tracks on the second album. Can't See Me, Shorty Wanna Be a Thug, Picture Me Rollin' are kind of the standouts on the back half of the album. I was, it's important, or not important. It's timely that you brought that up in the bio about him kind of being more political. I was hoping for that to be on this. I had forgotten kind of what the whole thematic content of this album was. I always, his he always got the reputation that he was, you know, a more thoughtful kind of artist and had more to say. And this, I think to a detriment, this really just kind of focuses on like street life and like violence and, you know, having sex with women or kind of wooing women and those things. It's kind of, there's not much variety in terms of themes or content in terms of what's on the songs.
Which is kind of shocking because he has the rep of being, you're like you said, more thoughtful, and you have 2.5 hours of canvas here.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can't give anything like space on this album. There's you know, like you said, way too much canvas to.
You get like I ain't mad at you,
right?
You know, yeah, that's about it in terms of thought.
So that was a real knock for me. Like it kind of wore me down after a while listening to it. I really didn't like the California Love remix. I don't think that really adds anything to the original. The original is perfect,
Agreed.
Perfect as it is. It's just distracting when it comes on because it's just put the original on if you want to hear the original. Some of the sampling is good. I ain't mad at you. I like the sample. I like the Shorty Wanna Be a Thug sample, which Kanye then uses later on Drive Slow. I always like that. So the lack of variety on here, I feel like, you know, as talented a rapper as he is, you lose some of that kind of appreciation of his ability on this as well, because he's just kind of saying the same types of things over and over again. I do like the way he says things and the way he kind of emotes, and like he's you know, he's like willing to laugh and like joke and poke fun, and a lot of artists, and especially like street life rappers, are really like deadly serious, and I feel like he has a lighter side to him. But ultimately I guess I enjoyed this album, but it's not something that I can come back to all the time just due to the length. I think you can cherry pick tracks and you know, you could make your own album out of this and make it a lot tighter and a lot more succinct. And so it's not, you know, he's always comes up as one of the greatest rappers, but I'm not sure this is like one of the greatest rap albums of all time in my opinion. And so it's really good, but it's not transcendent for me, especially compared to some of the other rap that we've gotten to by this point.
Yeah, it's I agree with you, Josh, that this is an interesting album because no album should ever be 2.5 hours. So
yeah,
I mean, it's that we'll start with that. So I get it. Like he was sort of, you know, holed up for a while, you know what I mean? And particularly I felt like he had a lot to say and get a lot out, which I get, because at heart I've always felt like Tupac was like an artist, you know, in the sense of the word, you know, just with creative energy, like an intensity, just sort of plowing over.
And his acting, to your point about that as well. I think
he's like ridiculously prolific in art forms and stuff, and he's got in like, if it was like 300 years ago, like Tupac would have been like living the like Lord Byron life, right? You get the feeling, or maybe more recently than that, but yeah, it's, you know, all eyes on me, you immediately get it, right? I think I read the quote that he said, you know, it's like, I got the feds watching me, I got females that want to, interestingly enough, his take on it was like, not like females who want to be with me, right? It's like females who want to hit me with false charges, right? I got like, you know, jealous guys, I got, you know, people. So like, it was what it was, right? There was like a paranoia to this whole album that fit thematically. I agree, I would have liked to see more thematic. It's sort of the same knock I had on that like NWA album we had, like how many tracks in a row can I hear of the same topic before, even though the tracks themselves are banging, it kind of wears you down. That's why I think this would have been so much better as a like 12 to 14 track album. And much like I did for Melancholy, Josh, I went through and picked what my 12 to 14 track album of this would have been. You are correct. I mean, you're not getting rid of any of the first 6 songs, because like Ambitions is a Rida, All About You, which you certainly couldn't write that song in 2025, but it doesn't make me any less like it in the year of our Lord 2025. Scandalous, Got My Mind Made Up, How Do You Want It, and Two America's Most Wanted, right? Like I'm keeping all 6 of them.
Yep.
I'm also keeping Hearts of Men and Life Goes On, like back to back. I'm keeping both of those. And I'm also keeping Only God Can Judge Me. So in this case, we got 8 of the 10 first tracks that are there. I am not keeping California Love Remix because I don't think it's one of the 14 best. Now, if it was the other California Love, I'm definitely keeping that.
Yep.
But it's not on there. The last track I'm keeping from side 1 and track 9 of this is I Ain't Mad at You, a song I always liked. And the one song that does show a little bit more reflection. I'm keeping Can't See Me on disc 2 for number 10, and I'm keeping Shorty Wanna Be a Thug for number 11. I'm keeping Wonder Why They Call You Bitch, another song that probably you can't write in 2025, but it is an interesting song, though.
It is,
because,
yeah.
It kind of is it's got a little bit of Brenda's Got a Baby in it, but, like, harsher. You know what I mean? Like, you don't necessarily get, like, the empathy, but, like, you get the idea that, like, he's trying to help you, but he's saying it matter-of-factly as opposed to like with a deeper empathy to it. But that's kind of the closest we get. So that's number 12. Number 13 would be Picture Me Rollin' is definitely going to be on there. And then I'm keeping All Eyes on Me, the track that goes along with his 14. So that's going to be my one there. I did laugh and find it funny because Matt often talks about like riding in a car like with his daughter or different people in it. There's multiple tracks that you couldn't play it, but What's Your Phone Number in particular I forgot basically has an extended 2.5 minute scene where Tupac is supposedly like he's basically doing phone sex with a woman, but just comically over the top, you know, phone sex. And it isn't even like that Ghetto Boys album where we laughed when he was like explaining the sex he was having in graphic detail. It was sort of like a role play, but you kind of get the feeling that it could have been something that like Tupac was actually recording in real life. The lines were blurred a little bit, but yeah, it was a lot right there. So it does feel a little bit like the talent of the artist and like the ambition of the artist here take away a little bit from each other because it's just so much coming in, I think dilutes the overall product of what Tupac was. And where it really stands out to me is the first 6 tracks, they're just humming and you're like, oh, this is an all-timer. And then like you said, it kind of like it loses itself with like a lot of filler and you almost lose track of like the stuff that's so good because it's an endurance test. Like I can't listen to an album for 2.5 hours, and I love music. You know, I had to listen to this as like disc 1, take a break, and then listen to disc 2. And I listened to it the second time as like the 14-song album that I would have imagined it would be, kind of like I did with, and that was a great album. And then I listened to it full on again, and it does wear you down a little bit. But there's so much good on here, though. It's impossible not to say thumbs up. And How Do You Want It is an all-timer sex jam. It's like one of the best you could have. Ambitions is a Rida is an all-timer first track on a hip-hop album. So that's there. Two of America's Most Wanted is the swaggiest rap song you can possibly have. You've got like peak Tupac and peak Snoop on the same album, which is incredible. I think All Eyes on Me with Big Psych is a deep cut. Picture Me Rollin' is not only a great song, but also something I say in my day-to-day life. Maybe not day-to-day, but I say it from time to time, you know what I mean? Say Picture Me Rollin', or at least in my head I say it. So that sticks around as like a fantastic thing.
A mantra.
And I do think it's an all-time like cover as well, this album.
That's
like
true.
Tupac throwing up the dub on the front and holding different stuff up, and having a face that like expresses somehow like 6 different emotions at the same time. That if you look at it 6 different times, you can imagine Tupac in 6 different mind states, which is kind of like the genius of Tupac. So thumbs up, but definitely I really wish, even like Melancholy, I didn't get bothered by as much for the length because it was bouncing around. And you almost embrace the excess because they do so many different styles of stuff. Yep. This is so similar that it's even more so. I'm like, he really would have benefited from 12 to 14.
Or also, it could have been, like make the first album or the first disc like one theme, and then make the second disc like all political, and like show the different sides of him. And like, I'm sure if he as prolific as he was, like he could have done a disc of just more interesting topics or something.
Well, and the
And
Don Illuminati theory is all over the place thematically, so it's
okay.
not like he stayed in this lane the whole time. I actually, spoiler alert, because we're gonna cover it. Like, I remember liking the Don Illuminati theory album better than I liked any of Tupac's solo albums.
Oh
So,
wow, I've never listened to that album, so I'll be interested to hear
so,
it.
hmm
Also, shout
so.
out to Snoop Dogg for one of the all-time great lines in All About You about seeing the woman at the Million Man March that was in Warren G's video.
I'll see the
It makes me
same
laugh
at the Million Man
every
March.
time.
Yeah. Yes, it does me too. Because there's a playfulness to Snoop, you know what I mean, that isn't in number the. It is. It's funny you mentioned that, Josh, because I laugh every time it happens too. Yeah.
Yep.